Welcome, thanks for tuning in. I'm Chuck Stout, and this is Stewart Bailey. This is our May offering for our monthly speaker series. This month is the 75th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe, the surrender of Nazi Germany, and the end of World War II in Europe. The war against Japan went on for another 3 months, and we'll get to that in September, but today we're commemorating the victory in Europe. Right up front, I want to offer a sincere and humble thank you to all of the people who served, those who came back and those who didn't, and those who served at home, working in factories, teaching, serving on committees, buying bonds, gathering fat in fat drives and scrap metal, and making all kinds of sacrifices so that we could win this war. There might be a couple of you in our audience. If so, we are in your debt. Thank you. Likewise, we want to thank all of you who have served our country, whether you put your life on the line in one of our armed services, or in the current pandemic, or if you've just dedicated your life to serving humanity. All of you who serve have earned our gratitude. Thank you. So Stewart and I kind of decided to team up for this. We both love doing this, and we knew we had way more that we wanted to share with you than we had time for. So this won't be a talk about battles and generals and strategies and geopolitics and casualties and things like that. Yeah, we know those are all important, but for today, we're going to concentrate on some of the late war ideas and technology that are still affecting our lives right now. Anyway, we decided that I would talk about some of the stuff that was happening before VE Day, and Stewart is going to discuss how those matured and developed into things we pretty much take for granted today. Okay, so 90% of you already know your World War II history. But for those of you who don't know, or who slept through your history class, here are the bare bones basics. You know, there are a surprising number of Americans who believe that World War II started on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Not quite. Japan had been fighting China all the way through the 1930s, and Germany invaded Poland more than 2 years before Pearl Harbor. Within just a few months, the Germans had taken over the rest of Europe. They were all set to invade England, but a few hundred pilots in their Spitfires and Hurricanes fought off a massive German Luftwaffe in their first major air battle that was fought entirely in the sky. Well, that's kind of an oversimplification. There were airplane builders and ground crews and doctors and nurses and firefighters and air raid wardens and aircraft spotters and these folks. And this thing. We'll come back to them shortly. The United States joined the war in December of 1941. You knew that already. Well, Germany continued into North Africa and East Africa, and then they invaded the Soviet Union. Big mistake. But by late 1942, the tide had turned both in Europe and the Pacific. The British were winning in North Africa, and in the Pacific, the Japanese never recovered from the Battle of Midway. By the way, I really like this photo of the Battle of Midway, because it's not. This is a photo of a model diorama, one of several that were created by a really famous futurist and designer named Norman Bel Geddes. He did it to illustrate these naval battles. So anyway, the Allies retook France in 1944, and even though they were clearly losing, the Nazis and the Japanese continued fierce, desperate fighting right up until, in Germany's case, more than a week after the Americans, British, and Russians had taken over Berlin. Look at those kids on the right, and they are kids, and they're not just wearing the uniform, they're a tank crew from the SS Panzer Division. The Pacific War continued for another 3 months. Oops, we were going to save that for September. Well, spoiler alert. During World War II, technology raced ahead at an astonishing rate. Sure, a lot of it was already being developed before the war, but the war just kind of turbocharged everything. So these are some of the big ones. We don't have time to cover all the technologies, so we just picked a handful to talk about today. Okay, what shall we start with? Radar? Okay, radar. Radar is an abbreviation for radio detection and ranging. You probably know the basics of radar. A transmitter sends out pulses of radio energy, and if there's something out there, some of that energy gets reflected back. And then a receiver picks up the return and keeps track of the time between the outbound pulse and the return pulse. And since radio energy travels at the speed of light, a little bit of arithmetic tells you how far away that object is. So radar was around for a while before World War II, and 8 different countries were doing research and playing around with it before the war. And in one of them, in Great Britain, a British scientist named Robert Watson Watt developed some early radar equipment that actually worked. So what was the first practical use of radar? What did they use it for in the very beginning? Detecting thunderstorms. A little bit ago, we talked about how this early radar system really made a difference during the Battle of Britain. They could tell when the Luftwaffe was massing for an attack, and they could get their fighters into position to be waiting. They could intercept the bombers before they dropped their bombs. So we all know what radar looks like, right? Well, the British radar displays didn't look like this. More like this. And actually, the operator had to interpret information from 3 different displays to get a full picture of where the enemy was. It was really hard. So information went from multiple radar sites, plus ground observers, radio reports from ships, and it all got assembled in the plotting rooms to get an accurate idea of what was coming and from what direction and how high. That's the plotting room over on the left. So what else could you do with radar? Well, with a smaller antenna, you could use it to steer searchlights to light up enemy aircraft for anti-aircraft gunners. Hey, if you can use it to guide the searchlights, why not the guns themselves? This was an American coastal defense radar in California. But you know, these radars just weren't accurate enough. They needed to use higher frequency radio waves. You know, higher frequency means shorter wavelengths. So you need really, really short wavelengths. No, I mean really short, like microwaves. Both the Soviet Union and the United States Bell Labs had developed the cavity magnetron. No, I didn't make that term up. And by the late 1930s, the British made a huge breakthrough in 1940 that made small, accurate, high-powered radar practical. You could put it on ships so they could navigate at night or in fog. They could look for other ships, good guys or bad guys. Or they could look for submarine periscopes. They could use it to aim their guns. So they got radar small enough that you could actually put it on airplanes, and that made night fighters a lot more practical. But finding other airplanes at night was still pretty difficult. So what if you had an anti-aircraft shell that wouldn't have to use a timer to tell it when to go off? Because that's how they worked. The gunners knew about how far the shells traveled in a given length of time, so they'd guess how high the enemy aircraft were and set a timer on the shell to explode at a certain altitude. But what if you made a very, very tiny radar unit? And what if you made it tough enough to survive being literally shot from a cannon and told it to explode not after a certain number of seconds and not necessarily when it hit something, but when it got close to something? Well, they did, and that was the proximity fuse. And tens of millions of proximity fuses were made in World War II. Next up, drones and smart bombs. You might say drones started even before the Wright brothers made a practical airplane. The idea of unpiloted airplanes traces its heritage all the way back to flying models, like these rubber band-powered airplanes flown by some pretty famous pioneer aviators. There on the left, that's Catherine Stinson. And that guy on the right is Sidney Cam. He's the designer that designed the Hawker Hurricane. This is Charles Kettering. He co-founded Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company. Yeah, you might know it by its initials, Delco. And he invented a whole bunch of stuff that you use every day. During World War I, the government asked him to come up with a flying bomb, an aerial torpedo. He teamed up with another guy who also invented a huge amount of stuff that you still use every day. That's Elmer Sperry. And they came up with the Kettering Bug. Cardboard wings, papier-mâché fuselage, 40 horsepower engine, launched from a dolly on a track so it didn't even have landing gear, and a 180-pound bomb. It would fly itself on a certain heading for a certain distance and then kill the engine and jettison the wings. And then it would fall and bam! I mean, boom! It wasn't very reliable and it never made it to combat, but hey, it pioneered technology that would make drones and smart bombs possible. Between the wars, while Sperry worked out gyros to keep full-size aircraft stable and came up with early radio control systems, the hobby of radio-controlled model airplanes caught on. So this is Reginald Denny. So is this. I like this one better. He was a British actor who moved to Hollywood and got into radio control so much that he started his own hobby shop and model company. He got to talking to an Army general once in 1936, and the general was complaining about how much it cost to train gunners and how lame the training was. And so Denny sold him on the idea of using large radio-controlled models as targets. By the time World War II rolled around, Denny's radioplane company had a contract, and during the war, they produced 15,000 drones for the military. Oh, by the way, this is Norma Jean Dougherty. She was discovered while working at the radioplane factory. She became a model and then a movie star, and we know her better as Marilyn Monroe. The Germans took the idea of a flying bomb and married it to another emerging technology, the jet engine. The result was the Fieseler 103, better known as the V1 buzz bomb. The engine was a pulse jet. It fired about 50 times a second, which made a very loud buzzing sound, hence the name. You can actually hear this sound if you want to. There's videos on YouTube. The Germans launched about 12,000 buzz bombs, sometimes more than 100 a day. So when you drop a bomb or you launch a flying bomb, the odds of hitting a small target like a bridge or a ship are pretty slim. But what if you had a way to guide the bomb all the way to the target? What if you could steer the bomb? Well, if you were a Japanese pilot in one of these, you could. This is the Oka, a 2,600-pound bomb with 3 rocket engines and a human pilot with no parachute. The Japanese had about 300 of these, and during the last few months of the war, 76 were actually sent on missions, and 7 ships were either sunk or heavily damaged by Oka attacks. Americans had a different idea. Why not put control surfaces on a bomb and then control it by radio control? And you put a big bright flare on the tail so the guy that's flying it can see where it is, and then you just guide it right down to your target. And Germany kind of thought out of the box with this one. Germany had a different idea. You take the whole cockpit section off of a twin-engine Ju-88 bomber, you replace it with a huge bomb, you bolt it to a fighter that has controls for both aircraft. They take off together, the pilot gets it close to the target, cuts the bomber loose, and then flies home to do it all again. Once again, hundreds of these were built, not very successful. I can hear some of you saying, but what about the kamikazes? What about the kamikazes? Yes, in the last few months of the war, the Japanese would pack airplanes with explosives and send the pilots out on one-way missions. Sometimes they got through the ship's defenses with devastating results. More than 50 Allied ships were sunk, and many more were damaged by the thousands of kamikaze attacks. Rockets! Well, you can't really talk about rockets without talking about Dr. Robert Goddard. He started dreaming about spaceflight before 1900 and was working on aerodynamics almost before the Wright brothers flew. He had ideas about how rockets could be used to travel into space and started doing research. When America entered World War I, he worked with the Army to develop a rocket-propelled explosive that would eventually become the bazooka in World War II. So he started working on liquid-fueled rockets in 1909, and by 1923 he had a working engine. In 1926, he launched the first ever liquid-fueled rocket. By the way, in this picture, the one that's in all the history books, a lot of what you're seeing is the launching frame. This is the part that actually flew. We've got a mock-up of one of these in the museum if you haven't seen it yet. Although Goddard had influential friends like Charles Lindbergh and Jimmy Doolittle, and he tried to get funding and support from the government and the military, they just didn't see the potential. So he was pretty much on his own. He continued to advance the science and engineering of rockets and guidance systems until he died just before Japan surrendered in 1945. Meanwhile, over in Germany, there was this rocket club. You can try to pronounce it if you want to. I'm going to stick with the Society for Space Travel. Back in the 1920s and 30s, these guys dreamed big. Space stations, flights to the moon, interplanetary travel. Like Goddard, they worked on developing liquid-fueled rockets, primarily with the goal of human spaceflight. The member list reads like a roster of who's who in rocket science. There was Hermann Oberth, kind of the father of German rocketry, and this guy, Wernher von Braun. Talking about Oberth, von Braun said, he was the first guy who, when thinking about spaceships, actually grabbed a slide rule and started doing the math. I'm paraphrasing. I'm sure that Werner spoke in German. But whereas Robert Goddard wasn't able to get support in the United States, the German military saw potential, and this was the result. When it flew in 1942, the V-2 was by far the most powerful, sophisticated, and advanced rocket in the world. It was years beyond anything any other country was even thinking about. And the US and the other allies took notice when these started falling on England in 1944. And Germany mass-produced it. They built more than 5,000 of them. The Allies already had plans to scoop up as many German scientists and engineers and technicians as possible, and now rocket scientists became a priority. Even though the Soviets were our ally against the Nazis, it was pretty common knowledge that they would be a major adversary after the current war ended. The story of how we managed to acquire 200 and some German scientists would make a great presentation on its own, but for now, it's enough to say that Wernher von Braun arranged to surrender to the Americans just before the war ended, and he and his team, well, I guess that's going to be part of the part that Stewart covers. Okay, jets. You know, there's an upper limit to how fast you can go with a propeller-driven airplane, and the quest for faster airplanes led to the development of jets. There were a lot of people trying to develop the next big step in aircraft propulsion, but these two have become the big names. On the left is a German named Hans von Ohain. On the right is Frank Whittle of England. Whittle actually patented his design for a jet engine in 1930, and he was ahead of Ohain for years. They were both working to develop jet engines in the 1930s, but whereas Whittle tried to get funding and support from the military, they just didn't see the potential, so he was pretty much on his own as a university researcher. On the other hand, the Nazis saw the potential, and Ohain got resources and funding. Does that sound familiar? In spite of that, Whittle and Ohain both had working test models of their engines in the same month. That was April 1937. Ohain was working with airplane builder Ernst Heinkel to build an airframe for the engine. The Heinkel 178 made the first flight of a fully jet-powered airplane on August 27, 1939, and they put an ace test pilot with, well, he was also an aeronautical engineer. His name was Erich Varsitz at the controls. The Nazi brass was impressed and authorized full-scale development of jet engines and aircraft. This was all super secret, so the British had no idea. By 1939, Whittle was working with engineers at Gloucester on preliminary airframe designs. Hitler's invasion of Poland might have had something to do with the sudden authorization in September to build 2 prototypes. And it seemed to take forever to get an airframe built. But hey folks, they were a little preoccupied with the Battle of Britain, you know? So the Gloucester-Whittle E-2839 didn't make it into the air until May 1941. About a year and a half after the Heinkel. Both nations developed twin-engine jet fighters, and both became operational at practically the same time. The Messerschmitt 262 started service in an operational testing squadron in April of 1944, and the first squadron of Gloucester Meteors was active in July. While the British chose to keep their high-tech over British soil, and they used them to chase buzz bombs, the Germans had no choice but to press the Me-262 into service immediately, and they were learning as they went. The Me-262 was really a more sophisticated design, and it might have made more of a difference in the outcome of the war if Hitler hadn't insisted on them being used for ground attack rather than as fighters. And, oh, by the way, Whittle and O'Hane became really good friends after the war. Okay, helicopters. The first helicopter was designed by an Italian. Recognize this? A guy named Leonardo da Vinci sketched this more than 500 years ago. But until the 20th century, nobody had the actual aeronautical knowledge and the lightweight power sources to make vertical flight possible. Many people worked on prototype helicopters, and the first really practical rotorcraft was invented by a Spanish gentleman named Juan de la Cierva. In 1920, he flew an aircraft with an unpowered rotor that he called an autogyro. Wait, did I say the rotor was unpowered? Why, yes, I did. Well, how can that possibly work? Well, you've all seen windmills, right? That's how it works. Air flows upward through the blades to make them spin. As they spin, each blade is a wing and it generates lift. Simple, right? Okay, there's a lot more to it than that, and this isn't an aerodynamics lesson, but yes, autogyros really do work. Cierva found solutions to a whole lot of the problems that had plagued helicopter design, and his work made it possible for others to build helicopters with powered rotors. And this was the first one. Once again, a couple of bright guys pitched an idea to the Nazis and got money for research and development. In this case, it was Heinrich Focke and Gerd Achgelis. The Achgelis FA-61 flew in 1936. In 1937, the helicopter was flown in the Deutschlandhalle, a big indoor arena in Berlin that the Nazis had built for the 1936 Olympics. This shows a practice flight with all the spectator seats empty. The pilot was Hanna Reitsch, an astonishingly skilled female Nazi test pilot. She didn't just do it once, she did it every day for 3 weeks to a packed house. Meanwhile, over in America, a Ukrainian immigrant was also working on a helicopter. Igor Sikorsky already had a pretty impressive resume. The first large airplane, the first multi-engine airplane, the first enclosed cabin, the first dual controls, and that was before he came to the United States. Here, he came up with the big Pan Am Clippers that started regular service on long over-water routes, and finally, with success and some financial security, he could return to something he had wanted to do since he was a little boy, designing a practical helicopter. His VS-300 first flew in September of 1939, but it went through several design changes and he tried different configurations. But what he settled on has become the classic single-rotor helicopter design, with one big rotor on top and one small anti-torque rotor pushing sideways on the tail. He refined it into the world's first production helicopter, and soon the Sikorsky Corporation was cranking out 5 of them every 6 days for the Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Royal Air Force, and the Royal Navy. The military put the versatile helicopters to work immediately, and in the first days of 1944, a Coast Guard Sikorsky flew cases of blood plasma from New York to Sandy Hook, New Jersey, saving the lives of a whole bunch of survivors of a Navy destroyer that had just sunk offshore. Then in April, an Army YR-4B rescued 4 survivors of a plane crash in the high, hot jungles of Burma. Helicopters continued to prove their value throughout May 1945 and beyond, but May is where I turn things over to Stewart. For those who came in late, I'm Chuck Stout, and this is Stewart Bailey. So you're up, dude. Take it away.
Thanks, Chuck. Later this summer, we'll be opening a new exhibit entitled World War II EU, which features many of the technologies that came out of World War II and that we use in our everyday lives. And while we don't have the time to cover them all, I'm not going to either because, well, if I did, then you wouldn't have any reason to come visit the exhibit, which we hope you will. So today we're just going to touch on a couple of the different technologies that were developed during World War II and were specific to the European campaign. And I'm going to start off with radar, which, as Chuck has told you, has been very important in World War II in the European theater. And it's still used in a lot of different places, but it's especially important to the transportation industry. Now, as an example, when you board an airliner today and fly anywhere in the world, radar technology is there to keep you safe and to ensure that you arrive where you're going. Even before the airplane takes off, the pilots receive weather forecasts that use radar to help figure out where the storms are that they need to avoid during the flight. Then, when the airplane backs away from the gate and heads for the runway, it's tracked and directed to the runway by the tower using a ground tracking radar. This helps the controllers know where everything is on the airport and to spot potential collisions or runway incursions that might lead to a bad day for somebody. Now, once in the air, the air traffic controllers follow and direct the flight to its destination using radar antennas and stations located all over the world. These are large, what they call area control centers, or simply the center. But before it gets to the center, in the first 30 to 50 miles around the airport, the local controllers help guide the airplane, because these areas are incredibly crowded as you're coming in and going out of airports. So that, as you see from this picture of the eastern United States, of all the airplanes that are in the air at one particular time, the airports are really where the congestion points are and need a special set of controllers. Now, once the airplane leaves that area, it goes on to be picked up by the radar in the control centers, and the controllers use the radar to help guide the airplanes across the country until they come in near their landing point, where they again come under the control of a local controller. Now, for extra safety, the airplane has its own radar systems, and most of them, all airplanes today, large airplanes today, are equipped with weather radar to show bad weather ahead, terrain radar to show them where the mountains and things are, and also anti-collision radar so that they can see any other traffic in the area so that they can avoid it and know what's around them at all times. And all these radars work together to make sure that you get safely to your destination. Now, also in the world of transportation, one that you might be a little more familiar with is radar is used on the ground to determine the speed of an object. And police forces also use these handheld radar units to monitor the speed of traffic. So make sure you're not speeding, okay? Because I'm sure they will catch you if you are, and you're likely to get a ticket for it. Now, how many times have you watched TV and in the night and you've seen the weatherman or weather lady up there talking about an incoming storm, and you wonder, what? It's a beautiful day. Where is this storm coming from? Well, they know because of radar. Radar, like these Doppler radar units, continuously send out pulses of microwave radiation out about 1,300 times a second, and those bounce off the water droplets in the air, and by using the changing wavelength, they can tell whether the droplet is moving away from them, away from the radar or toward the radar, and will be able to see where a storm is going. And so by tracking millions and billions of water droplets in the air, computers can plot where storms are going, what direction they're going, how fast they're moving, and all of this lets forecasters know so that they can tell you where the severe weather is, how soon it'll be here, and when you need to take cover from things like tornadoes. So weather is a critical part of, radar is a critical part of forecasting today's weather. Another place radar has been used is in space exploration. Many space probes have been sent out to other planets equipped with radar for determining the height of surface features. And one of the most famous of these was the Magellan probe that was launched to Venus in 1989. Because Venus is covered with dense clouds and it's over its entire surface, and you can never see the surface of Venus, Magellan spent 53 months using radar to penetrate the clouds and create a map for scientists of what the surface of Venus looked like. And it's someplace you're never going to go. I mean, we can't go to Venus because it's like 800 degrees and the atmosphere is all greenhouse gases and it rains sulfuric acid. So it's a really nasty place. But we now at least know what the surface is like, or what the surface looks like, because of the fact that Magellan's radar was able to map it and provide scientists with a radar map of that. Now, one more thing about radar, which you should know, is that when you heat up food in a microwave oven, you can thank radar. Because in 1945, an engineer by the name of Percy Spencer found that the radar unit he was working with melted the chocolate bar in his pocket. So he tried other things with that radar unit, like popping popcorn or cooking an egg, which blew up in his face. And he developed a type of oven using a cavity magnetron. That's that little thing in the lower right there that was just like the ones used in the radar units by the British in World War II. And they created a set of heating devices, ovens, that were used in commercial kitchens during the 50s and 60s, and even then they were called radar ranges. And the original ones were really large, and but today, they've been made much smaller, and I can't think of anybody who doesn't have a microwave oven in their kitchen, and that's all thanks to radar. Now, what does the future hold? Well, the potential for radar is a lot, because scientists and engineers are now looking at developing self-driving cars, and part of the whole suite of instruments which drive or helps the car know where it is or where it's going is radar. So that there's going to be a lot of use for radar in the future. Now, another thing that Chuck talked about was drones. And despite their shaky start in World War II, drones continued to be developed, and today they're everywhere. I mean, I'm sure some of you even have your own drones at home that you play with. And but right after World War II, they were mostly used for military purposes, such as flying into the mushroom clouds during atomic bomb testing to measure radiation levels. And for those purposes, they certainly didn't want a pilot on board because it was much too dangerous. But they needed to take those measurements, and so they sent in drone airplanes like these B-17s or the F-6F. The Navy also used drones in Korea for bombing or attacking bridges. They'd fly old F-6F Hellcats, and you can see in this one here specifically loaded up with bombs, and you can tell there's no pilot in the cockpit, but they'd use these for attacking bridges and tunnels and things like that in heavily defended areas in North Korea. Now, in Vietnam, they developed drones for use in trying to do reconnaissance over heavily protected areas in Vietnam, China, and so on. And they dropped these air-launched Firebee drones, which would go in and take pictures or electronics warfare readings, measuring their radar signals, things like that. And they would fly in, and after doing their mission, they would come out and be grabbed out of midair using like a big net type thing on a helicopter could grab them, and then they'd be brought in for processing of their film and so on, and then reused over and over for that kind of purpose. One of the most advanced ones, although unfortunately not a very successful one, was the M21 drone, which could be launched either from the back of the D21 drone. The M21 was the mothership that carried it. It was a Blackbird, or from a B-52 bomber, and they launched these to try to check out the Chinese nuclear site at Lop Nor, China. Unfortunately, even so these ones went 2,500 miles an hour and were able to get over the target and take pictures, various things went wrong, crashes and shoot downs and things like that, that it was never terribly successful, but they were the first supersonic drones to be operated anywhere in the world. Now, in the 70s and 80s, drones became used over the battlefield for watching the action and checking out where enemy positions were and so on during the Arab-Israeli wars. The Israelis were very big on using drones, such as one like this Pioneer drone here, which helped them to have such decisive victories in these battles of the 70s. And today, we still use battlefield drones in just about every situation. They've grown to the point that they're as big as some of these, such as the this one, the RQ-4, the Global Hawk, which has a 144-foot wingspan on it. And this can go up and hang out up, 60,000 feet above the battlefield and can stay airborne for up to 32 hours a day, surveying over 40,000 square mile territory in a day, so that these have become the new eyes of the generals. About 1/3 of all of the aircraft within the Air Force's inventory today are drones, such as these MQ-9 Predators, which I happen to get a chance to see here at the 147th Attack Wing at Ellington Field down in Texas. These are operated by the Texas Air National Guard, but an operator can actually be here in the United States operating the drone, and while it's overseas, the actual aircraft is overseas, they can fly them from here, and they can use them to observe, do all sorts of reconnaissance functions, and to drop bombs and fire missiles, which in the one picture there, they actually did let me fire a Hellfire and drop a bomb in the simulator, of course. Now, besides the drones that are used for offensive purposes, the military still uses target drones, and some like this Chuck-R-3 here are used, and they actually have a parachute so that they'll fly them out. The gunners on the ground can take their shots at these things, and if they survive, they have a parachute which lowers them back to the ground so they can be used again. But target drones are still very important to the military and are still in wide use today, just like World War II. Now, in the civilian world, the use of drones has exploded over the last several decades, and people like Amazon and Google are looking at the possibilities of delivering packages using drones. Although this is already going on in places like Africa, where companies like Zipline have been working for the last few years, delivering medical supplies and emergencies to isolated villages using drones. The doctor calls in an order for a medicine, drone is sent out with that medicine, drops it by parachute, and the doctor's able to treat the patient right away, which is a great advance over the past. Drones have been used for other things like protecting endangered species, like elephants, rhinos, whales, and so on, from poachers. The drones can go out and be at an altitude that they don't disturb the animals, but give conservation officers an opportunity to quickly apprehend any sort of illegal poachers that might show up on the cameras from the drones. And similarly, drones have been used to look for people in the wake of hurricanes, and you'd be used for search and rescue. In fact, a couple of years ago in New Zealand, drones actually were used to drop life-saving devices to a couple boys who were in a riptide. So drones have become big for purposes of search and rescue. And law enforcement uses drones today for things like border enforcement, fisheries patrols, pollution monitoring. And because of all the privacy issues, surveillance by drones is tightly controlled, but they've proven valuable for searching for missing persons and tracking criminals on the run. So you're going to see a lot more of these. And they've even been used to fight pirates on the high seas. About 10 years ago, off the coast of Somalia, pirates were raiding ships, cargo ships and tankers, and drones were used to help track the pirates so that they could be captured and their lawless ways put to an end. So drones have had a big impact on law enforcement. And they've also been valuable for science. because agencies like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration use drones for reporting conditions inside hurricanes, and NASA uses them to study the atmosphere and map wildfires among the many missions that they do with them. And drones, of course, found their way into entertainment, being used for filmmaking and television, and providing a new visual vistas on things like covering sports events and so on. And of course, I don't want to forget that they're used by hobbyists worldwide and are even involved in exciting new sports like drone racing. Who knows? Maybe you have a drone like this at home and take up racing. It's a lot of fun. And I should mention too, by the way, that our exhibit on drones will be at the museum until July 26th. So make sure you come out and see it before it goes away. Now, let's talk rockets. The V-2 missile was proven to be an unstoppable weapon during World War II, and the Allies knew that the Germans were way ahead of the rest of the world in developing large liquid fuel rockets. So they tried gathering up as much information as they can, and at the end of World War II, the United States captured over 300 train car loads of V-2 rocket equipment, plus 126 of the German rocket scientists and engineers, including Dr. Wernher von Braun. And their work in America would change history and lead to humanity's journey into space. So today, rockets play an important part in our lives, and they provide us access to outer space. You know, within a few years of the end of World War II, a new conflict began between the two allies, former allies, the United States and the Soviet Union. And while it never erupted into direct hostility, the Cold War lasted for almost 40 years, and both sides threatened each other with possible annihilation. And the main tool for doing this was the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or the ICBM, which were large missiles which were capable of reaching another continent. Both the US and the Soviet Union built their missile programs off of the V-2 rocket technology captured from the Germans. America launched over 60 V-2s from White Sands, New Mexico, while the Russians, in that picture on the right, built the R-1 missile, which was a copy of the V-2. Both countries built thousands of missiles in the 50s and 60s that would have, if they had been used, would have destroyed most life on Earth. Today, due to arms reduction treaties, there are far fewer of these missiles, but the US and Russia still maintain a large arsenal that can be launched from submarines or in-ground silos. And I'm more concerned of the fact that countries like China and North Korea have joined the ICBM club, so it's still a certain number of these missiles are out there and make the world a dangerous place. But on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union used the rocket for an entirely new purpose when they launched the very first Earth-orbiting satellite, Sputnik 1. It was about the size of a basketball, and it orbited the Earth every 90 minutes, transmitting a radio signal to the world below. And it was followed on January 31st, 1958 by America's Explorer 1. Now, both these satellites were placed into orbit using versions of missiles that were originally built as ICBMs. In fact, the Redstone, which carried Explorer 1, was designed by Dr. Wernher von Braun and his team of former German missile engineers who were at that time working for the United States Army. Now, today, thousands of satellites are in orbit around the Earth, ranging from military spy satellites to communication satellites and GPS. And every day, we use cell phones that rely on satellites to transmit millions of phone calls around the world, as well as there's other satellites like the EchoStar here, which bounce television signals around right into your home. One of the special ones, though, is the GPS satellite, which provides positioning, GPS meaning global positioning satellite. And, you know, every time that we take our cell phone out and try to find out map to the store or something like that, you're actually using a satellite to tell you where you are within a couple of feet on the surface of the Earth. Now, during the 1960s, as part of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US were engaged in a space race to see who could do first, who would be first to conquer outer space. And the Soviets got off to the early lead when they put a human in space, when they launched Yuri Gagarin on April 12th, 1961. But they also were the first to put a woman in space, the first multi-crew in space. They accomplished the first spacewalk and built the first space station. Yet in the end, the United States won the space race by achieving the ultimate goal of placing humans on the moon on July 20th, 1969. And this was followed by 5 other successful landings between 1969 and 72, which ended the space race. Now, since these first rockets reached space in 1944, tens of thousands of satellites, space probes, and manned spacecraft have gone into space all aboard rockets. And they've allowed us to send robotic space probes to all of the planets in our solar system, as well as study comets, asteroids, and the sun to give us a new view of our universe. And also, they've helped us with some of our big building projects, like the space shuttle was used heavily to help build the International Space Station, a gigantic laboratory complex the size of a football field, which has been circling our planet every 90 minutes at a speed of 17,500 miles an hour. And over the last 20 years, people from 17 different countries have lived and worked aboard the International Space Station. And think about that. For 20 years, people have been living and working in space. And every bit of the food and the water and everything and all their equipment has all been brought up there by rocket. So that while there are other technologies being explored for putting objects into space, for the foreseeable future, everything going into space is flying on rockets that were related directly to the V-2s of World War II. Now, I want to talk about jets. And as Chuck mentioned earlier, the jet became a significant technology in the final months of World War II, and is one that has an incredible impact on the world today. The turbojet engine, which was the type that was used on the German Messerschmitt 262, is pretty much the type of engine that we're still using today. It's, if you look at this quick drawing here, you can see where air is sucked in through the front, compressed by all those compressor blades, and then it's they add fuel, and it's ignited for an explosion, which causes hot gases, which go shooting out the back, and they turn the compressor blades, which spin the front of the engine. And so it's a whole series of suck, squeeze, burn, and blow that makes the jet engine work. And this is pretty much the same principle that works today on all jet engines. And the jet quickly became used by the military. By the Korean War, most of the airplanes that were involved were jets, including 1952 when the first jet-to-jet battle happened, when a US P-80 shot down a Russian-built MiG-15. And then, as I say, the other side had MiGs, which their engines were actually a direct development of the Whittle engine that Chuck talked about. So that this World War II technology just kept going right on into the 50s. And by Vietnam, every major Air Force and Navy in the world was almost exclusively flying jet airplanes. Now, one of the innovations that came out of this was also the afterburner, which allowed jets to go supersonic. And the afterburner basically just takes the particles, the unburned fuel particles, it adds a little more fuel, ignites them, and fires them up again, which gives an extra push of thrust, which allowed airplanes to, as I say, be able to go supersonic. And today, many airplanes actually can go supersonic without using the afterburner in like these F-22 Raptors, which can fly on what they call super cruise, which is literally flying without an afterburner, but still being able to break the speed of sound. And the jet has allowed us the fastest mode of transportation. Other than the rocket, there has been nothing that works as fast as the jet, as shown by the SR-71, which is the fastest aircraft ever built, with an ability to fly regularly over the speed of 2,100 miles an hour, or Mach 3.2. Although the design of jet aircraft was directed during World War II was directed at combat aircraft, it didn't take long for jets to be used for airliners. And the first of these to appear in service was the de Havilland Comet in 1951. And jets offered a lot of advantages over piston engine airliners because they flew faster, they were more fuel efficient, they were quieter, and they could fly higher, which took passengers over the rough turbulence of weather in the lower atmosphere. Now today, most all jet airliners are powered with what we call a high bypass turbofan engine. And on a turbofan, unlike the turbojet, there's a big set of blades on the front, fan blades at the front, that direct some of the air through the engine. The rest of it goes around the engine, creating extra thrust. And this helps create a more fuel-efficient engine, create extra thrust. It's a lot quieter. It is definitely a better engine and makes, as I say, it makes perfect sense for flying in today's airliners. Now, not all the airplanes that you see at the airport are powered by or look like jets. Some of them actually still have props, but that may surprise you because you know what? They may have a jet on board. They may have what's called a turboprop. And here it's a case of a jet engine that's driving a gearbox which drives the propeller. And the exhaust coming out, it does create a little thrust, but most of the thrust comes from the propeller. And these are great for airplanes that don't have to fly real fast and they can carry a heavy payload. And as I say, they're very fuel efficient as long as you're not trying to get there at high speed. And one other use of the jet, which you might be surprised at, as the helicopter. Because today, most helicopters use jet engines, but they're called turbofans. And these give them higher performance and speed than their World War II brethren could have ever thought of. They began with in the 1950s with the French Alouette helicopter, like the one we have here in the museum. What a turboshaft does is it actually uses a jet engine to create hot gases, and those power a turbine wheel, which turns a shaft, which is then connected up to the transmission to run the rotors. But turboshafts also have a lot of other uses as well, including things like M1 Abrams main battle tanks use a turboshaft engine. So they actually have a jet engine in the tank. And similarly, ships like the Coast Guard Hamilton cutters and the Ticonderoga class missile cruisers use the turboshaft engines as well. So that's jet powered for ships. Now, lastly, I wanted to touch on helicopters. Helicopter was, while it was really a shaky use in World War II, there weren't too many of them, it really kind of came to its own in Korea. And many people, you know about them from like the television show MASH, where they were used for casualty evacuation. But they were also used for a lot of other things, like moving squads of troops and for reconnaissance and so on. So that the helicopter became very important in Korea. But it was not until Vietnam that the helicopter was used en masse to deliver and pick up troops from forward combat positions. In fact, helicopters were used so much in Vietnam that the UH-1 Huey utility transport helicopter has become literally a symbol of the Vietnam War. And just like Korea, the helicopter was used as a flying ambulance, saving tens of thousands of lives by rapidly being able to get wounded soldiers to a field hospital for treatment. And this would later give rise to a major revolution in medicine. Another mission that came out of the Vietnam War was the helicopter gunship, which acted as escort for transport helicopters and could be used as mobile artillery for the troops on the ground. And they've been used in every war since then. Now, one of the first uses for helicopters in World War II was for search and rescue, and it still remains one of the most important roles of the helicopter. During Hurricanes Katrina and Harvey, the Coast Guard rescued thousands of people off of that were trapped by rising floodwaters and had to be taken off their roofs and so on. And they also have been used extensively for the role of air ambulance. This developed out of the experience of Vietnam. And in 1972, Denver-based Flight for Life became the first company to use helicopters as ambulances to transport critically ill or injured people to hospitals for treatment. They started out using an Alouette 3 like the one here in the museum. And in situations where seconds count, the helicopter's ability to land in a small space and fly over traffic to rush a patient to the hospital has saved thousands of lives every year. Now, sometimes you need a helicopter because you got to move something that's so big that there's just nothing else will do. And in cases where you need to move things like power poles or transmission towers to far off high mountain ridges where nothing else can get there, a helicopter is your way to get it done. Or in fighting fires, helicopters are also important too. Whether they carry a big fire retardant tank or a bucket like for picking up water, they can pick up water, lakes, streams, rivers, or even swimming pools to drop on fires with pinpoint accuracy. So out west here, the helicopter has become an incredible firefighting tool as well. And they're also used as an eye in the sky by police for things like car chases or looking for missing people and things like that, so that the helicopter is a real eye in the sky for a lot of different civilian uses today. And one of the most unusual uses of the helicopter is for things like the maintenance of high voltage wires, where you can't, in remote places where you can't get a lift truck in there, you have to bring the workers to the line, and the helicopter can hover alongside so that workers can do maintenance on the power lines, again, in areas that are far too remote to bring in a vehicle. And lastly, just for the fun of it, there are a lot of times that you can take a helicopter ride in places like Hawaii for just the fun of seeing the sights. So, and over the last few decades, there have been some changes in the helicopter, including the development of what they call tilt rotors, where the aircraft can take off vertically like a helicopter and fly horizontally at high speed with, with the rotors extended forward like propellers. And the Marines were the first to use these with these big V-22 Osprey tilt rotors. And they've found these very effective in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where they have to get in and out of tight spaces sometimes, but they also have to be very fast in doing it. And not to be left behind, the civilian world is working on these as well. And the Leonardo company is working on an AW609 they hope to have certified for civilian use, which would be great today as like an aerial taxi to take you to to places where you might not necessarily have a runway. Anywhere there's a little open space that you can land, you could land and take off with one of these tilt rotors and do it at very fast speeds. So that today rotorcraft have become some of the most versatile machines in aviation. So as we wrap up this discussion, you can see that there's a lot of significant impact from World War II. Many of the technologies and devices that we use every day came of age in World War II and were critical to the victory that the United States, Great Britain, and Russia shared over the Nazi Germans. And just as importantly, many of the innovations that the Germans developed or were experimenting with when the war ended became important to us and have helped people in the world to live better, more productive lives. And we hope that you will learn more about this in the World War II and U exhibit later this summer. And I thank you very much for your time.